Right, so to start introducing this panel, I'll sort of give a brief summary of where the idea is coming from, and then introduce our panelists and let them take it away. Um, so the sort of organizational idea here was to sort of think about space and its representation and use in a variety of ways, forms, and angles. Obviously, in medieval and medieval fantasy spaces, um, the environment and space plays a very large role in shaping how people see these worlds, how people interact with them. Um, and so I wanted to sort of bat around thoughts about how we model, represent, and discuss these sorts of spaces. And so, to that end, we have three panelists coming from different aspects and areas of um, how we look at these things. Maria Vargha is an archaeologist who works specifically with GIS. Acer Lewis is a teacher and independent researcher of 18th century environmental and intellectual history. Um, and Madeleine Sterns is an sort of art and architecture historian. I'll give each of them a sort of slightly longer introduction when it comes to their time to speak. And so we will be starting. We're happy, I think, with the order of Madeleine, Asa, Maria. So we are therefore starting with Madeleine, who, as just mentioned, she's currently finishing her master's degree in art history at John Cabot University in Rome. Her academic interests range from ancient to early modern, with a Mediterranean focus. And recently, she's been delving into studying representations of art and art historical narratives in digital worlds. Madeleine, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much. You can hear me okay? Okay, good. Sometimes my computer sounds like it's gonna take off like an airplane, so I just wanted to make sure. I do have some visuals for you today. So let me get that up and running. Maybe. Oh, it was working 2 seconds ago when we did the practice for 2 seconds. Let's see. Okay. I'm not even, it was working before. Oh, there we go. Okay. Can you see my screen? I can't see anybody else, so you're gonna have to give me a verbal
Yeah,
something.
we can see that.
Great. Okay. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you all so much. Was really fun. And so while I'm not a developer myself, I'm a historian, art historian. I've always been on the production side of video games, but have always been looking at them through the lens of someone who studies architecture and art history. And that's just left me with so many questions. And I thought that my pitch to you today would be, centered on questions that we can then use in discussions, breakouts for the workshop itself. Um, so I'm really fascinated by the use of real world arts and architecture as tools in video games, whether they are, used directly to represent what they are, or if the concept of architecture is kind of turned on its head to serve a new narrative or a new purpose and that kind of thing. But I wanted to start this out with a brief story that I think you all might enjoy. So one day, about a year and a half ago, I was a history teacher at a local middle school. I was teaching eighth grade history, so 12-year-olds. And a student came running up to my desk with this big monochrome drawing, ink and graphite on paper of Gothic ruins with crooked trees and like a snowy background, and claimed that it was original artwork. And I tried really hard to like hide my disapproval because I was like, oh, it's really good. But I said it's very, it's very good, but it is a copy. And the student looked at me and was like, "What do you? No, it's not. I drew this from a landscape that inspired me." And I was like, "Yeah, sure, the landscape paintings of Caspar David Friedrich. Like, this is either Monastery Graveyard in the Snow or Abbey in the Oak Wood." Like, it was just it was too perfect to have been something that a 12-year-old could come up with. And the student said, "No, this is from Dark Souls." And I was like, "Oh my God." And sure enough, I pulled up some images on Google and showed the student these two paintings. And the student was like, "That's Dark Souls." And I was like, "That's incredible. This is that you think that this is Dark Souls. This is not Dark Souls. Like, this is a 19th century romantic painting. Incredible." So after this encounter, I had to figure out, what was going on here. I was aware of the Dark Souls games, but not really how in depth the representation of architecture could have been. And so, with the help of YouTube and Reddit, I think I've isolated, kind of this location as being the apostate derelict located in the consecrated snowfields of Elden Ring. Um, and I mean, if you had told me that either of those paintings were titled "Apostate Derelict of the Consecrated Snowfield," like I would believe you. That's the vibe, 100%. And so I had a lot of questions regarding representation of medieval spaces, and I did some sleuthing and learned that the director Hidetaka Miyazaki, in interviews, has stated that he was inspired by the literary works of H.P. Lovecraft and Bram Stoker. But both of these authors were in turn inspired by what they considered the medieval England Anglo-Saxon Golden Age, as part of the artistic and academic medieval revival of the 19th and 20th centuries themselves. So there's this whole lineage of creative aesthetic borrowing that is really doing something when it comes to representing material to produce meaning and setting, especially. So this is probably not a revelation by any means to most of you, but I can't help but see places as in the real world or in video games as living things. And so I wonder where the decisions for space, design of space really, come from, which comes first, the story or the setting. And there's probably a joint development that goes on there, no doubt. But to quote Miyazaki himself, he said, "I want to leave the interpretation of the world's stories to the player. And that's actually the biggest reason for focusing on environmental and subtle storytelling." And so the game is purposefully vague. And so the player can interpret and build meaning as they play and experience spaces, objects, and actions cohesively. Spaces are not actively explained to the player in that sense within this game. And so even architectural materials, oh, sorry, I think I have a little thing hiding. There we go. Okay. And so even architectural materials, in the real world have history and meaning through their use. And this includes resources like wood, stone, metal, glass, paint, painted surfaces, and textiles, any combination thereof. And I just wanted to, think about what does the presence and use of these materials in digital spaces tell us about the narrative of the game's environment. Um, this question comes out of a very hot and exciting realm of art history as far as discourses go, called materiality. For those of you who don't know, materiality is defined as the meeting of matter and imagination. And I think that's a wonderful definition, first of all. And critical art historian Michael Anna Hawley, in her essays on Notes from the Field, written in Art Bulletin, explains that materiality is not just about information of the material itself, but how the material has passed through time and through the lives of people, human interaction, right? So materiality has been becoming increasingly popular, and Holly explains that this might be a kind of retaliation to digitization and reliance on technology and virtual substitutions for art and art objects and things like that. But I would like to, bust that open and say, let's bring the discourse on materiality right into the digital world. These things don't have to be in opposition of one another. And Holly almost says something about video games at the end of her discussion in this paper when she says that digital images cunningly illustrate materiality without being material. And I think this just couldn't be more true. And I've got some examples for you. So, whether a game is aiming for hyperrealism or on any spectrum of stylization, I think that all of these working questions about materiality are applicable because there's a lot of different ways to convey the appearance of a material in a digital setting because you don't have to touch it; it's just appearance based. But there's a lot of ways to do that. Um, so we can think about how rare or abundant are certain building materials. Are they location specific? Is there variation? Um, what constitutes as a common or a significant space? Like, how do you know when you've entered a more important region or zone or building or anything like that? Is it, because of the materials that are around you, the setting? Is there a value scale for materials in games, and is it conditional? Only in certain situations is it, or the way that it's decorated indicates something more valuable, um, or what have you. And furthermore, who or what are spaces for? Is it an object-centered space where your goal is to go in and interact with objects in that space as a player or a character, or are you there to interact with other characters and produce action-centered spaces? I think these are just things that we can think about. And so I would also like to bring up this example. So we can explore the use of perceived materials as tools to express the level of fantasy within the medieval game genre, right? So there will be fantasy to some degree, right, when we're recreating the past. And so, how impossible or how realistic are the materials that compose these spaces? Do certain materials have properties or appearances that connect to the lore of the world? Like, you know, is it a fortress made of bones of dragons? It's a fortress, and the form of it is castle, realistic to some degree, but then it's composed of these giant bones of animals that could have never roamed the earth, that kind of thing. Or, excuse me, this example is an underwater scene from World of Warcraft of some ruins. And I would like to highlight how the column that's fallen over there in the sediment, the silt of the riverbed, that it has broken in the same way that an ancient Doric Greek column would break into these kind of clear cut segments, because that's how ancient Greek columns of that period were constructed. They were not carved from one single piece of stone, they were actually constructed in drums, exactly like that. And so this column neither belongs to a post Hellenistic world, or is it actually stone at all, right? And yet, in the worlds of Michael and Holly, it has this cunning illustration of materiality, passage of time, and interaction with humans and lifetime without being material at all, which I think is just really cool. So some of us got to talking yesterday in our breakout session about this kind of thing of investigating, how do we represent the past? And I just wanted to kind of bring that up again because I think we'll continue to talk about it. So is there a sense of the past in games? How do we represent that with architecture? Is there kind of an allusion to a former glory, a fallen regime, or a loss of a wealth of a nation? Or on the other side of that are these gleaming new buildings that are perfect and pristine and kind of represent the ushering of a new age. Medieval churches took hundreds of years to build, and that was an accomplishment of human engineering. And I think digital spaces can also evoke that same sublime feeling, and so we should go for it. And so how do the materials themselves, the condition of the materials, give us a sense of the past? What materials kind of have this more advanced or former, I don't know, formerly good, sense of use to them? And I would like to, uh, this is a very interesting example. So ultimately, decorative elements of the built environment serve a purpose and create meaning as much as the dialogue and actions of players and characters in games, right? So what happened what happened here? Is something about to happen here? Is it a boss fight or a meeting with a powerful ally? Why? How do we know? Perhaps there's interplay in the ambiguousness and surprise or suspense and the uncertainty by architectural surroundings that we build. I would also like to assure developers in the room that there was some fears expressed yesterday about, oh gosh, we're going to put all this energy into a game and, people aren't going to see it. And I think just because that information, you know, like the Dark Souls director, said, Miyazaki, that just because it's not handed to the player doesn't mean that they're still not perceiving it. Just it's just happening on a different level, and I think environment is very much worth investing in visually for players to create meaning through materials. So, thank you.
Thank you. Um, okay, so moving swiftly to our second speaker. So Acer Lewis is an independent researcher of environmental history and intellectual history, particularly focused on the Habsburg Empire. He's currently focused on understanding how late Enlightenment attitudes about landscape and governmentality contributed to the drainage of southern Hungarian wetlands. His background is in the social history of the Ottoman Habsburg borderlands, and he's worked on projects studying 18th century German print media and early Habsburg cartography. Um, Asa, please. The floor is yours.
Yeah, hi. That's a broadly accurate description. I started off in Ottoman Habsburg history, sort of social history, and only after finishing my dissertation, finishing my thesis about German print media, did I sort of move toward an environmental history. So I am not nearly as knowledgeable as I think Maria might be about um, mapping and GIS data. This is something that I'm passionate about and interested in. Regarding the integration of landscape and video games, I think a very good example might be Kingdom Come Deliverance, which I talked about in the last panel or the last conference that James attended, and this is something that I think a lot of you have played before. I maybe you can like raise your hands if you know if you've played this game before. I see one. I can only see like, oh, that's a lot. Hello. Yeah, so this is a game that's set in late medieval Bohemia, in a region, a sort of agricultural region to the southeast of Prague. And it was a game that is sort of become famous, that has sort of become famous for being based on real places. So the character you play can roam around between these various cities and towns, and they're all real places that are more or less accurately uh, placed in the correct eh, uh, orientation to each other. The geography is pretty much correct. Um, but something that not a lot of people know about is this game. When the game designers designed the landscapes, and I'm not 100% sure. I've reached out to Rocks or what's the name, Warhorse Games, to ask them this question, and they never got back to me. They said they referred to me to their media manager, and they said they were too busy. So hopefully they'll have a new game out, and wasn't just a brush off. But when they designed this landscape, they didn't design it using modern maps, modern Google Maps. I think that they probably incorporated it, but actually they used the first Habsburg military survey. This was a mapping project in the 1760s to 1780s that made the first topographical map of the Habsburg Empire. And I will share you some screens if I can do this. Okay. So this is a mapping project. This is the picture of Sasau or Sasava. On Google Maps, it's right about here. Oh, there it goes. So Sasau is a location. It's a town. All of the locations are more or less correct to what they look like now, but there are some significant differences, and you can tell that they designed Kingdom Come Deliverance using uh, the original map from 17. I think this was 1765 or so. And there's a hold on. Let me see here. So Ratai, there's a road oriented here. There's also a windmill, or not a windmill, a water mill here. Currently, they developed it into an electrical station in the 19th century, I believe, late 19th century. But this was a mill, and they used this to build the mill that where what's his name, Henry lives. And there are a lot of other key details that they use that are based upon this mapping effort. This was the first map. This is the first um, depiction of space with high accuracy of the whole region. By the way, you should know this is all been uploaded on Project Arcanum, sorry, which is a Hungarian digital humanities site. They have enormous quantities of maps and data, and it's excellent. I mean, they've got maps from 3 centuries worth of landscape. So this is a really useful and interesting resource because it tells us a lot about what the landscape looked like pre-industrialization. This is a really key thing. A lot of my work focuses on water, and there was an enormous effort starting in the late 18th century to divert water courses, to straighten water so that you have less flooding, and also to manage water so that you can grow more crops and have better irrigation systems. This, by the way, should be mentioned, had enormous and continues to have enormous ecological problems, ecological damage. The Danube River, which was one of the largest let me see, get this out. The Danube River had it was one of the largest fisheries in Central Europe, and they up until maybe a century or 50 years even ago, they apparently had these giant fish. Sturgeons, I believe, but they were 5 meters long, and you can still see their heads in some old taverns around Vienna. But these are all gone because the wetlands that fed the animals that these fish eat were all drained, and then the fish were fished to extinction. There was also a giant dam project built in Slovakia. This is besides the point. But looking at these maps, it does show you some interesting details. I'll share again. So when you look at the map of Sasau, it's really interesting because and Kingdom Come Deliverance did a really good job of representing the way humans designed landscapes in the game, in the organization of towns and cities. One example, if you go to Sasau in game, there's a church. There's the monastery of Sasau, but in the town of Sasau itself, there's a church, and you can see it down at the bottom. It's that large red spot right here. And you'll notice if you go there in game, it's at the highest point in the town, the highest landform point in the town. And as you go down towards the water, it gets very low. It's flatlands, basically, sort of marshy. And then this is where you find the prostitutes in the game, the bathhouse. And so this sort of it's like a hierarchy of value of people in society and structures is quite, I think, accurate based on how people live and how people design the world that they inhabit. That's one point I wanted to make. The other was that this is not actually there is a danger with using these maps. Uh, so the the landscape of Kingdom Come Deliverance is, I think, 14. I don't remember the name or the year, the 1460, something like that. Uh, this was right before the Hussite rebellion and the wars of religion. So you see the Sasau monastery in construction, and it's a bustling town, bustling space. That all of that construction was abandoned because of this conflict. And actually, there was an enormous amount of depopulation, apparently. There was a lot of destruction wrought by this war. So when you look at the map made in 1760, it shows you a landscape that is perhaps less inhabited than the medieval landscape would have been. And I don't have any statistics or data to back this up, but there's an opportunity that is presented by using maps, but there's also a danger. Um, so I also, as a last note, I want to point out that when we think about the medieval world or medieval Europe, there's sort of expectations about agrarianism. There's expectations about sort of proto-industrialization, the use of mills and that sort of thing, uh, and the division of society, structured society into a certain hierarchy, feudalism, and that is broadly accurate for certain places, but not for others. So one example is in southern Hungary. Um, this is something that I'm quite more interested in, or more knowledgeable about, I should say. Southern Hungary and Slavonia and what's now Croatia were extremely uh, damaged, I suppose, ravaged by the Ottoman invasion. So that's the 16th century. So a lot of the patterns of settlement and the developments there um, is what you see today is not what it was, if that makes any sense. And I think this is also a really good segue into Maria, her topic. But when we talk about how people live in space, I think that there's the last point that I wanted to emphasize is that there's a whole variety, a whole uh, spectrum of human activity, of mobility, people who are traveling with their herds, who are practicing humans agriculture, and people who are using space in ways that we are unfamiliar with. Wetlands, for example, were a huge region of historical southern Central Europe, and they have since been drained. But these spaces were a source of a lot of economic activity. This is something that is sort of forgotten. But that's all I wanted to say, and yeah, I'll pass the mic.
Thank you. I have a lot of feelings about Fenland, which we may or may not get to later. But for the time being, I'm delighted to introduce as our last panelist for this panel, Maria Vargha, who is an archaeologist and who is currently principal investigator on the Sacries project. I'm gonna stab at the pronunciation at Charles University in Prague, which is investigating rural Christianization and church networks in Central to Eastern Europe. She completed her PhD at Central European University in 2019 and was a research fellow at the University of Vienna in the Department of History Digital Humanities Group. She is particularly a specialist on GIS mapping software and digital map modeling in the investigation of medieval societies. Maria.
Thanks so much, James. Thank you for this lovely invitation. I have to say two things. First, there's a really lovely snowstorms as I'm looking out in the windows, which might be the cause of my internet issues. So if something happens, I'm sorry about it. And the second one is it's exciting for me to participate in this conference, but I am by no means an avid gamer. I really like watching other people play. but I am not a big gamer myself. So my knowledge gaming wise might be a little bit like patchy, so to say. And what I'm here to talk about today is not exactly what I'm doing right now or specifically what I'm doing, but I thought that maybe we could have a kind of more general chat about space and medievalism and why space is important in that sense, both in the academic world of investigating the medieval period and both in the context of gaming as such. And I think the most important thing when we are talking about medieval space, and I'm so happy that I'm the last speaker because you guys had such lovely images before me that I really don't need any, which I didn't bring also, so it's perfect. Is that because there are two things I think that is very important when we are talking about medieval space. And one is that some of us, at least, so if you're talking about in the context of Europe, then we still live in it, right? So those who are living in cities in Europe, there is a really great chance that we are still living in those medieval cities, or at least which used to be medieval cities as well, which means that part of the medieval heritage lives with us. So there is a certain continuity of space, and there is a certain continuity of identity as well, which takes us to the uses and abuses of the medieval times, right? And I think where space is really, really important here is that, especially if we're talking about immersion type of games like Kingdom Come, then the space is what makes the experience real. I'm sure that many of you, or at least I know I frequently do that, that when I walk the streets of Prague, where I live now, sometimes I just daydream and I try to imagine how spaces looked like in in the medieval times, or if I, if I'm in the countryside also and I see some modern stuff, and I try to just imagine the landscape. Maybe it's an archaeologist thing, maybe it's a medievalist thing, I don't know, but I'm sure that I'm not the only one who does that. So we have a sort of continuity in the landscape. We relate to this landscape. We walk the streets sometimes that the medieval people walked. And therefore, when we create this sort of immersion environment for people to experience the Middle Ages, then I think what's important here is how we fill it. Because I am all for reconstructions, and I'm all for creating a more complete view for the people, because I really, really strongly believe that there is an importance that we can learn from the past, and in order to be able to convey these messages to the general public, then we have to give them an experience, right? So I think there are wonderful examples for this. For example, when you have like augmented reality or something like that, when you go to a medieval ruin and then you can see an approximation how it looked like. Now the difference in these kind of academic reconstructions and gaming is that the academic ones rarely give you a full-on medieval experience. It focuses on certain elements of the space that you experience individually, and you don't have a storyline with it, right? As if you would have in gaming. And you also have a sort of indication of what is the imagined and what is the kind of truth that we have still remains. Now, we don't have that in the games. And the issue is, I think, what we need to think about is that when we create these hyper realistic medieval environments, is that how we fill it with. What are the ideologies that appear? What are the sort of semi-hidden or not hidden, or like just kind of like semi-conveyed messages that we are putting into this space to which people can relate in this way. So that's the first thing, is why space is important. Okay. And the second thing is how we approach space. when we study space. And I think there's an interesting reflection in that with the gaming industry, but a little bit like delayed. So if you think about that, what we had until the 80s and how people were able to approach space, I think is very, very interesting in the terms of how space generally appears in games today. So if you think about how a medieval village or estate looked like, we all have this kind of ideal maps that are appearing in pre-80 scholarly works and also in games. Usually you have an estate. So you have a castle or you have a manor house, you have a mill, you have a forgery, you have a village, maybe you have a pond or something like that. And maybe if you are like trying to be more realistic, then you have some fields and you maybe show that this is the three line field system and you have one for this and for that and for that. And so I think this is something that is very prevalent in earlier research because what you had was basically written sources, which I think if you're talking about spaces, then you have to make a very clear distinction here about urban spaces and rural spaces. And obviously, the urban spaces are much more overrepresented. Just like in any kind of sources in medieval history, we know more about the rich and the famous. And if you think about that, who comprised of society, that's a very little part of it. So the majority of the society were really the low class people of whom we don't know as much. So we wouldn't know from written sources the details of their life as much as we know this like upper echelon. So if you talk about cities, then of course there's a lot of potential for reconstruction because as we said, a lot of it still lives with us. So for example, you can have street structures that are easier to reconstruct. As well as villages, what you have is exactly what Acer showed. The best you can have is these 18th century maps, which are great for some things and not so great for other things. So, for example, when you want to see which were the most um, important kind of settlements and so on that still existed in the 18th century, and you can presume that they had medieval origins, and you want to see kind of how they were connected by roads, that's lovely. And also you can see a lot of toponyms and other traces that refer to earlier settlements that did not exist already in the 18th century, but you can recognize it from remnants of medieval times. So for these kind of networks and like larger picture, it is great, but it's not always very, very accurate when we are talking about the individual places. For that, you could have had archaeological research if you're lucky. I think maybe some of you have heard about War and Percy, for example. So you have to be lucky, but there are some places where entire structures of medieval villages have been preserved and were able to be exploited, which is great. But again, we are still talking about the village itself as it, for example, appears on those model arrangements that we were talking about, that there are the houses, there is a church, tavern, whatever. But we are not talking about that the actual life of the people were so much bigger in terms of space than these villages, as Acer already referred to this. So, for example, in Kingdom Come, what you can see is that there are fields that have different crops and it's changing, but all the people are in the villages, right? Do you think that in medieval times people were like hanging out in the villages all the time? I don't think so. I don't think they had the time to just, always hang around in the tavern and stuff like that. So you don't see the people actually like use the space. Or if you can think about, for example, forests, right? If you go into the written sources and what you can see about medieval forests, and I'm not just talking about perambulations and these kind of things, but about how forests were worked. They have such an extensive vocabulary for forests, for the different stages of the forest and for the different kind of tree growth, because they used it very, very differently. So forests were just as much worked, for example, as the fields. And so this kind of external space of medieval life, where most of the life was lived, where most of the activities were happening, this never appears almost in these type of games. Although actually that's quite prominent in nowadays in research. So what I want to say is that if we talk about the pre-80s research where the resources and possibilities were limited, then you can see that what you see in the focus are individual sites like castles or churches or villages, maybe making a typology of castles, making a typology of village layouts of churches, of these type of things. Maybe try to see the villages or the towns as like some sort of social spaces, but all that you can recover from archaeology and history based on the limited or less limited research material based on which areas you're dealing with. And I think the big difference comes around the 90s and up to that, where digital humanities enters the sphere of archaeology and history, and where more advanced technologies actually allow you to do so much more than it was possible before. And the end result of that is basically that you are not really focusing on so much on individual things, but more like processes happening in space, let it be social, economic, religious, or environmental. And this environmental thing, I think, is especially exciting because the new technologies allow us, for example, the reconstruction of pollens from sample cores, meaning that we have a much better grip at what kind of environment we can expect in certain places. And with, for example, GIS technologies, um, we have the opportunity not only to try to recover some sort of past networks. Of course, we have to reflect on it, how much it is our projection or not. So this kind of criticism always needed. But also we can make an attempt to reconstruct these environments as well. So I think these are mostly the issues that I wanted to raise, that the space that medieval times was lived at is so much more big than we imagine it, and then how we kind of see it represented in popular culture, and the importance of what we fill these hyper realistic space with. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. That's been a fantastic trio of discussions.